Well, hello YouTube, it's me Fortmaster, and welcome back to another JaruJaruJ reaction. So it has been a long time since I've done a reaction to one of their videos, also a very long time since I've done a reaction to one of their character analysis videos, because this is Deltarune Spamton character analysis, a nuanced tragedy. Now granted, this video is 3 years old, so it's a little outdated, given, what we learned in Chapter 3 about, the connection between Spamton and Tenna. But I have gotten a number of requests recently to actually react to this video. And I've never watched it. And, again, it's been a long time since I've watched one of JaruJaru's videos. So I expect this to be a very good character analysis. And, most likely make me think of Spamton in ways I've never actually thought of him before. Honestly, no idea what's going to happen, but I'm looking forward to it. So, might as well get this thing started. So, yeah, of course, as always, original videos linked in the description if you haven't seen it yet for some reason. Corner video, link to my Let's Play of the day. But yeah, so, if you like this video or any other video that I make, I very much appreciate it if you gave the video a like and subscribe to my channel, because over 3/4 of the people that watch my videos aren't subscribed, and I'd very much like that to change, given that my next big goal is hopefully hit 6,000 subscribers by the end of this year. But yeah, with all that out of the way, let's get this thing started then, shall we?
Hello, my name is Jaru. Today I'm talking about Deltarune. There will be major spoilers for both Deltarune and Undertale, so please play them both before watching this.
Undertale?
Today, I will be analyzing one of the most fascinating, tragic, and popular characters in Deltarune, Spamton G. Spamton. However, since Spamton is such a hugely complex character to analyze, I will be splitting this analysis into several videos. Today's video will be part 1, and it will be focused on exploring the story and themes of Spamton's life. Spamton's story is shrouded in mystery, but we know enough about him to weave a coherent and compelling narrative. Rest assured that while I will be presenting his story with my usual dramatic flair, I won't be adding any speculation without clarifying that I'm adding speculation.
Okay, I just remembered, I think this is part 1 of, the series where I did, a reaction of, either part 2 or something where Jaru was speculating on what hyperlink blocked actually means. If I remember correctly, I think they boiled it down to one of the most likely candidates being, the word love, as in, LOV, level of violence.
And just to be certain that I'm portraying Spamton's story correctly, I will always have the source for whatever part of his story I'm currently discussing on screen at the time. After retelling his story, I will then discuss the very fascinating themes and morals that Toby Fox seems keen on emphasizing with this character. And just to be clear, the future parts of this project will be where I focus on actually solving Spamton's mysteries and providing my own theories. This video is simply a literary analysis. That said, there's a lot of deep, emotional, and beautiful things to be found in Spamton's story, so I'd still suggest watching this video even if it's not focused on theory crafting. Oh, and before I forget, I have a Patreon now, so if you'd like to throw some money my way, I'd greatly appreciate it. Without further ado, let's dive into the dark, tragic, and extremely engaging story of Spamton G. Spamton. Once upon a time, within a section of the Dark Realm known as the Cyberworld, there was a particular variety of Darkner known as the Addisons. As their name would imply, these fellows are the premier advertisers within Cyber City, with each one being an expert salesman. With their bright colors, stylish v-necks, and long pointed noses, you'd be hard-pressed to mistake them for anyone else.
Honestly, just thinking back, it's that age-old question about how does a dark world actually have history? And I remember, there was the whole speculation that also the theory that I subscribed to was that they kind of took their history from the real world objects they were based on, the Darkners, And then there was the whole thing in Chapter 3 where it turned out that, seemingly maybe Chris and, like, Noelle one day just literally brought stuff from the library home and started playing with it. And just, the Darkners could also just be created from their imaginations. With, like, the stories they created while playing. Which, while saying that, I know that doesn't completely disprove, the whole thing where, the previous theory. I mean, honestly, you could have both happen at the same time, where, object's normal history is life plus whatever, light in our imagination happens.
However, amongst the Addisons, there was one Darkner who didn't quite fit in. While he had the same trademark V-neck, he lacked the iconic green pants, was far shorter, and had a longer nose. But make no mistake, the peculiar appearance was only the tip of the iceberg when it came to this very odd man.
Yep.
This is Spamton. Like all Addisons, he was a salesman. But unlike the others, Spamton never quite had any luck in his business.
Honestly, it's one of those things, like, I don't think Spamton, like, if you were to prescribe them, actual histories, I don't think Spamton ever, looked like this for his entire life. I love the depictions I've seen where, like, when he was, like, younger, he looked more in line with, like, the regular, Addisons, at least, like, dress-wise. But then as, like, he gained more popularity, he put on the suit. But then as things came down, like, things got worse and worse, and he eventually looks like this.
Business, as his products never seemed to sell. However, despite his misfortunes, Spamton kept his spirits high, and when hanging out with the other Addisons, he would often insist that one day he'd make it big. You just watch. Someday, I'm gonna be a big shot.
Yeah, before he went crazy and lost the ability to speak properly.
At a glance, you might make the mistake of thinking Spamton's dream was to achieve great wealth or fame, but for him, it was more than that. He didn't really want money or popularity or...
Again, the writing in this game, you just gotta love it where it's like, I'm a salesman, I was never in it for the money. I mean, that is such an odd statement to say.
Or even power. All he wanted was freedom. The freedom to call his own shots. The freedom to choose his own destiny. This dream would be the driving motivator behind everything he would go on to do, as he was truly determined to make that dream a reality. However, things would get worse for Spamton before they got better. As his business continued to flounder, he started getting desperate, and he became willing to try anything to find success. This led to him making contact with a mysterious entity on the phone. It's unknown if Spamton contacted this entity by chance or if this entity reached out to him. But either way, this would turn out to be the big break Spamton had been waiting for. This person on the phone started helping Spamton in some major ways, as Spamton suddenly became far more successful in his business.
Which, thinking about it, like, we assume that the voice on the other end was Gaster. I mean, that's always been, the running theory. But, like, how did he help? Was it just, the whole thing where, like, Gaster gave him, like, actual useful tips and tricks and actually helped him? Did he, like, by talking to Spamton, did Spamton gain, like, an unnatural charisma where he was, like, able to convince people to buy his products more readily than he did before? Because the whole thing was, like, it's assumed that it's kind of assumed that, Spamton went nuts, after he lost contact with whoever was on the other side of the phone. So, like, the idea that, like, it was either, like, lack of new tips where people got wise to his tricks and started, they stopped being as useful, or he needed, like, a re-injection or, like, a new supply of that unnatural charisma that he couldn't get anymore from the phone. God, what was it? How did he help Spamton so much?
The other Addisons noticed that he was on the phone all the time, presumably with this mysterious benefactor. Whatever aid this entity provided proved to be extremely impactful as Spamton rose to unprecedented levels of fame and fortune. The Addisons, jealous at Spamton's newfound success, stopped hanging out with him, leaving Spamton with no other companion except the mysterious entity on the phone. Little did they know, this abandonment by his fellow Addisons would have far-reaching consequences. However, in the meantime, Spamton's success was meteoric, and he was soon granted a room in the Queen's mansion. The room he was given was the same room that would later be given to a Lightner, and Lightners are regarded as gods by Darkners, so to be given the same honor as a Lightner just further demonstrates how much of a big shot Spamton had become.
Yeah?
He was involved in big TV deals, big cars, and big commercials. Everything seemed to be going incredibly well for Spamton.
The Mona Spamton.
All his dreams had finally come true. But then, something changed. The specifics are unknown, but to outsiders, it seemed like whatever had been helping him find success disappeared. And without the aid of the mysterious entity, Spamton's career soon came crashing down around his ears. That said, this collapse did not happen all at once, and there was a notable period of time during this disaster in which he still lived in the Queen's mansion, and it was around this time that he discovered something that would be integral to his future. Down in the basement of the mansion, where the corrupted data was stored, Spamton stumbled across something incredible, an artifact of some kind. It's uncertain exactly what this artifact was, and it's also unknown how Spamton learned of its existence, but what we do know is that Spamton became obsessed with it. As his career fell apart, Spamton began spending more and more time in the basement. What was he doing down there? Well, according to the butlers who were there at the time, Spamton would spend hours on end praying in front of this artifact, and the butlers theorized that Spamton thought this relic may hold the secret to his next big break.
Honestly, I did not know that part. I didn't know he was praying to it. I mean, granted, thinking back to my playthrough, I don't think I've ever actually gone back to those rooms and talked to the butlers in front of them. But man, that's interesting. So before he went to take it as his own, he actually was worshipping it. Huh. Okay.
Unfortunately, Spamton did not seem to find what he was looking for in time, and soon he was evicted from his room at the mansion and kicked out on the street. On the day of his eviction, he begged them to stop taking away his furniture, but it was to no avail. These butlers and other high society folks were not his friends. They may have treated him well when he was wealthy and successful, but now that he was down on his luck, he was no longer a valued customer.
He was just a customer the entire time, nothing special.
And was not worth their time. Just to add insult to injury, they struck his name from their records, and when they sold his bow ties in their stores, they would make sure to rip off Spamton's name from the label.
Brent? Oh! I never knew that. Oh, wow, okay. Again, just raises so many more questions about how history happens in a dark world.
Very cruel. On that final day in the mansion, it's believed Spamton had one last intense phone call with the mysterious entity, and Spamton seemingly walked away from the call mid-conversation, as the entity could still be heard talking on the other end. We can only speculate what was said between them, but given Spamton left mid-conversation, and given that his life had collapsed around him, we can only assume that he and the phone entity had not parted on good terms.
No, yeah,
and now,
definitely.
Without any financial support, the high society discarding him, and with all the Addisons having abandoned him out of jealousy, Spamton was left homeless, hopeless, and utterly alone. The best time of Spamton's life had come to an abrupt end, and now it was time for tragedy. You see, Spamton didn't just lose his apartment and his job during all this. No, his suffering was far worse than that.
He also
At
lost
some
his
point,
mind!
We don't quite know when. Something terrible happened to Spamton's mind. His speech had become incoherent and garbled, with advertisements and sales slogans forcing their way into his every sentence. His mood became dangerously erratic, with him being overwhelmingly high energy and aggressive one moment, only for him to suddenly collapse into a subdued, bitter depression the very next.
Man, honestly thinking about it, it reminds me, I remember I saw this one comic years ago. I think I've talked about it once before, but it was a comic where, like, an Addison comes across Spamton in, like, a dumpster, and, like, takes pity on them because, again, they didn't know how bad it had gotten for him, and just kind of took him in, and, like, started trying to nurse him back to health in their house. It was like, I mean, I need to reread it sometime. That was a very sad but very thoughtful comic.
If that weren't bad enough, Spamton's grip on reality became very tenuous, to the point that he'd scream at people who aren't even there, or randomly get lost in his own dark memories, completely ignoring the reality around him in the process.
You know, it sounds like these when I'm actually, like, sitting here listening to Spamton's story and actually comprehending, like, taking the time to actually comprehend what happened to him. And, like, I remember, you know, going back to and playing Chapter 2, you know, you go into Spamton's shop and it's all weird and freaky and kind of funny, you know, it's like the sun painted on the wall, it's all supposed to be happy with, like, the glitchy edge in the phone. But now actually thinking about whatever happened to his life and how he's, like, essentially homeless and, you know, crazy on several levels, and the fact that his own story is just, it's a facade trying to depict better times. Oh, God, honestly, the more I think about it, the more depressed I am thinking about it. Like, it is honestly so sad. Ugh.
To say that Spamton was now suffering from extreme mental illness would be a severe understatement. There are many factors that could have contributed to his mind becoming fractured like this. His only friends had deserted him. His mysterious ally on the phone had seemingly hung him out to dry, and his one dream of becoming a big shot had been torn away from him, and he was now left homeless, literally sleeping in dumpsters. All this could have been what caused his mental collapse, but one cannot help but wonder if the mysterious entity played a larger role in Spamton's mental decline.
Probably.
Had it done something or said something that traumatized Spamton this badly? Did this strange artifact stored with the corrupted data play some role in his illness? It's hard to say. Whatever the cause may have been, Spamton's life had been thoroughly ruined, and after being betrayed by every friend and ally he had ever known, Spamton's fractured psyche was then filled with hatred, bitterness, and regret.
Yeah.
However, this was not the end for Spamton. You see, there is one thing you need to know in order to truly understand Spamton.
You can't keep a good salesman down. Or maybe you can if death of a salesman is to be believed.
One attribute he possesses that rests at the core of his character.
Determination.
Spamton G. Spamton, more than anything else, is defined by his unwillingness to give up, his refusal to back down, his dedication to his dream.
Okay. You know, Jaru, I see what you did there. You went specifically out of your way to not use the word determination. I see what you're playing at.
In other words, Spamton is defined by his perseverance. When his business failed, he never stopped trying new things. When his phone ally abandoned him, he never stopped looking for his next big break. And when all of society had turned on him and forced him to live in the dump, even this wasn't enough to stop Spamton from chasing his dream. He may have suffered some psychological damage along the way, but even in the midst of his mad ravings, a driving intelligence clearly still motivates him. That all said, while Spamton's dream of freedom still burned brightly in his heart, his strategy for achieving that freedom had undergone a notable shift. Before now, he had believed that he could achieve freedom through wealth and fame, but his experience now showed him that this was not a viable pathway. Wealth could be stripped away. Popularity could vanish in the blink of an eye. If he wanted the true, lasting freedom to pursue his own destiny, he would need something more concrete.
He would need to cut his strings and go into heaven. Guys, I swear, I love all those videos where you have Alex Rourke actually like voicing Spamton. He is the definitive Spamton voice for me. You cannot change my mind.
Something nobody could take away from him. Spamton needed power. Power that could not be rivaled. And somehow, some way, he had come up with a plan to acquire that very thing. Hidden within the Queen's basement was an old machine that wielded terrifying power, and Spamton had discovered a way to fuse himself with this robotic body. It's likely that Spamton knew about this old machine during his time at the mansion, and while not confirmed, the artifact he spent all his time praying in front of was likely this very machine. And now that he had figured out how to fuse with it, all he needed to do was sneak back into the mansion and get down into the basement. However, this would prove a lot easier said than done.
Honestly, thinking about it, it's one of those things where, like, how did Spamton do it during the weird route? Because during, the normal route, Spamton gets put into the disc and then requires us and Chris to put the disc in so that he can fuse with the body. So, like, how did he do it in the weird route where, supposedly he's doing it just by himself? Like, did he, put the disc in the chest, then, set to close it just as he was merging with the disc so that he, has a really weird timing thing? Or, what?
As the Queen's mansion was very well guarded, this next period of Spamton's life was dominated first and foremost by his many attempts at breaking into the mansion. And while we don't know about all his various efforts, we do know about a few of them. Once, Spamton tried impersonating Swatch, the Queen's head butler. That's why Spamton wears a completely black and white outfit with multicolored glasses. Prior to this plan, Spamton likely had an outfit that more closely resembled the other Addisons, as evidenced by these posters showing Spamton without his iconic glasses.
Huh. Okay, that's another thing I didn't remember. I mean, granted, it's been a long time since I, played Chapter 2 and actually, paid attention to it. Huh, okay.
Regardless, impersonating Swatch obviously failed, as Spamton looked nothing like the butler.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show how far his mind had fallen that he thought this plan was even remotely feasible. The next plan that we know about came sometime after the Roaring Night created the Dark Fountain, as it was during this period that the Queen became more tyrannical, and more Darkners started to openly rebel against her. One such group of rebels was the Sweet Cap'n Cakes, who Spamton tried to hire to sneak into the mansion. However, this plan never got off the ground, as the Sweet Cap'n Cakes refused to accept the job because, and I quote, "We're just rebels, we don't want to get in trouble."
Poor sweet innocent boys. You were not ready for this world.
These are the only known attempts Spamton made to infiltrate the mansion.
But I assume he would have done more.
It's entirely feasible that he tried and failed at a number of other plans too. The exact timeline here is unclear, but given that the butlers talk about Spamton like he was a long-forgotten figure, it's quite possible that Spamton spent years or maybe even decades living in the dumpsters of Cyber City.
I mean, think about it. It did say it was what was it? The best salesman of, what was it, 1997? So, assuming that, like, you know, hit his peak and then almost instantly began falling off, we'll say maybe, you know, he hit, you know, he was kicked out of the mansion. Let's be really generous, 3 years after that. So, like, let's say he started, you know, in 2000, and it's assumed that, you know, the game takes place, you know, the regular Deltarune takes place modern day, so at the very least, that's 25 years.
Desperately trying to pursue his mad plan. This, of course, means that we now have to add years upon years of failed break-ins on top of all of Spamton's other failures. I cannot overemphasize just how much perseverance Spamton had to possess to stay so devoted to his dream in spite of so many painful setbacks.
And again, Jaru, I'll say it again. Like, the fact you're not using the word determination when it would also equally work in this context. I see what you're doing.
It is at this point in the story that we finally reach the events of Deltarune Chapter 2. The decrepit salesman, after a lifetime of misfortune, finally seemed to have a stroke of luck, as one day, seemingly out of nowhere, a lightener showed up right outside one of his dumpsters. Spamton, even as deranged as he had become, could clearly see an opportunity here. A lightener would have a much better chance of getting into the mansion than any darkener, so he desperately began trying to convince this strange blue person to help him in his plan. However, as
not blue enough for the splurfs,
realized, this was no ordinary lightener. There was something different about this one, something familiar. Whether due to his madness or just plain old empathy, Spamton seemed to relate to this lightener on a fundamental level. Even with them hardly speaking, Spamton was able to tell that this lightener, this Chris, was a kindred spirit. Someone who was also suffering under the heel of a cruel world. Someone who had the same dream as him. Someone who desperately wanted freedom. After inviting Chris back to his shop in the dump, Spamton further demonstrated just how much he valued Chris, as he states outright that he and Chris are already fast friends, and that they don't need anyone else. Yeah. It's at this point that you start...
Which, I mean, honestly, you know, that could be taken out of context being a little creepy.
To realize the parallels between these two figures. Both considered freaks and outsiders, both struggling for freedom, and both incredibly lonely. It's no wonder that Spamton projects himself onto Chris in much of his dialogue, as the two really are cut of seemingly similar cloth. After some...
Yeah, except, you know, Spamton isn't being controlled by an extra-dimensional demon. Well, that being said, I do remember there was the one, you know, comic where, you know, Spamton did manage to take the soul, and then almost immediately we, the player, take control of them.
Conversation, Spamton makes his request of Chris. He asks them to go into the basement, retrieve an empty disc from the old machine, and bring it back here. Chris obliges. They do exactly as Spamton requested, and Spamton, overjoyed, uploads himself onto the disc. Chris then takes the disc back to the machine and puts it in. After years of struggles, years of planning, and years of suffering, Spamton, through sheer perseverance, had achieved his goal.
You know what I only just realized, and I honestly can't believe it took me this long to realize it. You know, Spamton Neo has, you know, the strings and stuff like that. I only just realized, you know, when you see, like, the Metaton Neo body, or whatever this is here, like, it's draped in, like, vines and stuff like that. I only just connected the dots that that's where the strings on Metaton Neo come from. Oh my god.
And thus was Spamton Neo born. By acquiring the power of this old machine, Spamton instantly became the single most powerful entity in the Cyber City, and easily the most powerful Darkner that Chris had ever seen. Finally, Spamton had real power. Finally, he could realize his dream. Finally, he could be free. Or
Until...
rather, that's what Spamton had thought. Mere moments after acquiring this new form, Spamton realized it wasn't enough. He still wasn't free. He was still, as he put it, just a puppet on strings. It's unclear whether Spamton is referring to the literal wires powering his new body, or if he's referring to more metaphorical strings. Whatever.
I mean, we have seen, there are certain characters that, can break the fourth wall and stuff like that. Even if just slightly. Maybe, I always took it rather literal when when Meton sees these strings on his new body. But what if he literally became powerful enough to realize, hey, wait, I'm in a video game. I'm still very limited here.
Whatever the case, the result is the same. He had failed again. Even with all this power, he wasn't truly free. But, as is the way of Spamton, he still didn't give up. If this much power wouldn't do it, then he'd need more. And sitting right in front of him was Chris, who, within their small, fragile body, contained the incredible power of a human soul. Spamton, in the first truly evil act that we ever see him commit, turns on his only friend.
Honestly, thinking about it, so, obviously we know human souls are much more powerful than monster souls. So do you think this would have played out any differently if it was, say, like, Susie that had come across them and was helping them? Would they have gone after Susie's monster soul as well? Or just, human soul is the most powerful, so I must have it?
Spamton, in his madness, insists that he's doing this for both of their sakes. He insists that by giving him their soul, they will both become big shots. They will both become free. However, before he can follow through with this, Chris is rescued by their friends, and a fierce battle between Spamton Neo and the Delta Warriors commences. However, even while fighting to the death, Spamton never stops talking to Chris. He continues to try everything he can to persuade Chris to join him. He pulls out every salesman tactic he has to try and sell Chris on this insane plan. And what is perhaps his most insane line yet, he tells Chris that he can't force them, echoing his line from their first encounter. Even now, even while trying
as
to
he's literally fighting
Chris
him,
and steal their soul, Spamton still finds the idea of forcing Chris to be abhorrent. He finds the idea of taking away Chris's freedom unacceptable. Spamton's mind...
Honestly, again, thinking about it, I still love the idea that, from what I've seen of some people, that, the secret boss of Chapter 6 will focus very much on Rousey. Because, again, Chapter 2, we have Spamton focused very much on Chris. Then, not really... we do get a bit more stuff about Chris from, what you can see with the Secret Knight, with, the Roaring Knight in Chapter 3. But then you have Chapter 4, and it's the secret boss, Gersten, is all about Susie. So I very much, love the idea that the next chapter will be, the next secret boss will be, oh god, from what I saw, Sans or something, and they're fighting Rousey at some point. That'd be wonderful.
Is so warped that he can't comprehend that stealing Chris's soul is forcing them, which only makes this fight all the more tragic. In his own twisted way, Spamton really does seem to care about Chris, but any value he places on their friendship is squashed under the weight of Spamton's madness and his own obsession with achieving his dream. Even so, If there's one fact that you can always count on, it is this: Spamton will always fail. That is his destiny. And that is...
You know, it's funny. You'd think that'd be like stop the presses, but given that it's like censored, it's like the F word. Like, you imagine he's using like the F word for this, like F the presses.
Exactly what happens here. As the Delta Warriors cut Spamton's wires bit by bit, attempting to disable him without killing him, they eventually whittle him down to one last cord. At this point, Spamton concludes that they are actually trying to help free him from his puppet strings and is touched by their act of friendship. And in a moment that demonstrates Spamton's mad character perfectly, he cuts his own cord in the name of friendship and freedom.
On closer inspection, maybe the Chris to cut the, but Spamton ordered them to do it, so the effect is the same. Yeah, I mean, like, I wouldn't have thought, you know, Spamton cut the wire. That very much looks like one of us doing it.
Defeating himself in the process. This was the final straw for Spamton. He had tried so hard for so long to achieve his dream, and he had failed at every opportunity. Even becoming Neo had failed miserably. And while Spamton was defined by his perseverance, even he could only suffer so many failures before losing hope. And this final defeat was too much for his little heart to bear. Cracks had been forming in Spamton's mind for a long time, and now, after everything, his spirit had been broken entirely. The world had beaten Spamton down his entire life, and now he was done fighting back.
Okay, you know, something I just realized, you know, for the longest time when I saw this spread, I always envisioned it as, like, you look here, so this is Spamton's head, and, like, I always envisioned that, like, this dark line and, like, this lower part right here where it was his mouth, so it's, like, his mouth is kind of, like, hanging open, or it's, like, But it only just occurred to me, like, this is his black shirt and the white... This is, like, Black Shadow and the white shirt under his suit. Like... It honestly does kind of ruin it for me, because I like the because, like, you look at all of his other sprites, and he has a very big mouth. So, like, I always liked the depiction of him having, like, while hanging there. But, like, oh god, it's always what you focus on.
In his final moments, all his energy spent, Spamton seemed to regain some semblance of his sanity as his speech became clear and comprehensible for the first time in a long time.
Yeah.
It seems, after all, I couldn't be anything more than a simple puppet. But you three, you're strong. With a power like that, maybe you three can break your own strings. Let me become your strength. In his final sane act, Spamton chose to give what power he could to the only real friend he'd ever made. The only person who seemed to truly understand his plight. And so, the story of Spamton G. Spamton comes to a close.
God, and that's the thing. I really feel the pain, because if this video was made today, I would have loved to have seen, you know, how it went forward when you meet, like, Tenna in Chapter 3, and there's that little thing where Tenna has the Peepus and stuff like that. I would have loved to have seen that depicted here. Just hear, like, Jaru talk about it in, like, this, like, dramatic style. Oh, that would have been wonderful.
A simple man with a simple dream who, in the pursuit of that dream, was abandoned, betrayed, broken, and forsaken by his friends, partners, allies, and world. A tragedy, to be sure, but a very nuanced tragedy. From a storytelling perspective, there are many interesting and engaging themes within Spamton's story that contribute to him being such a memorable character. And while I could never cover them all, I would like to draw attention to the 3 themes I found to be the most interesting and meaningful. The most obvious of these themes, and the one that's most important to Deltarune's overarching narrative, is that of freedom. Spamton's main goal in his story, from start to finish, is to achieve freedom. And while the exact nature of this freedom changes, the reason he wants it stays the same. He wants to choose his own destiny, and he is willing to do anything to achieve this. This hunger for freedom is what draws him and Chris together, as they too desire freedom from the one pulling their strings. Even though Chris has no real agency, that doesn't stop them from empathizing with Spamton. And after seeing Spamton fail miserably in his own quest, this rather clearly has an impact on Chris. In the conversation after fighting Spamton Neo, no matter which answer you give to this question, Chris's true feelings shine through, causing Ralsei and Susie to take note of Chris being uncharacteristically upset. With the greater context of Spamton's story, it's quite easy to tell why Chris would be so disturbed.
Man, thinking back, I've talked about it before about like a comic I've wanted to commission. About, like, you know, at that one scene in chapter 4 where Chris is kicking the soul in the garbage can during the weird route. And I always like the idea that in that story, this would be the first instance of the player or something like that fully coming to terms that they're not controlling like a puppet or a player character or something like that. They're actually controlling Chris, an actual person.
Spamton's entire purpose in life, the goal that he had been pursuing for decades, was to gain freedom. And yet, even with that single-minded devotion, Spamton still failed. If someone as devoted to their dream as Spamton still failed to achieve freedom, then what chance could Chris possibly have? This realization is, in my opinion, a big part of why Chris is so upset. They are terrified that they too will end up just like Spamton, a puppet unable to cut its own strings. Speaking of which, Spamton actually draws comparisons between himself and Pinocchio, saying, "My days as a long-nosed doll are over. Cut that wire and make me a real boy." This is a very interesting parallel for Toby Fox to draw, as it showcases how Spamton's story is, in many ways, the exact opposite of Pinocchio's. Pinocchio starts his story as a lifeless puppet on strings, but after being granted life and overcoming several obstacles, the puppet grows and becomes more human, with his story culminating in him becoming a real boy. Contrast this with Spamton. He started out believing he was a real man with real agency, but as his life went on, he started to realize that his freedom wasn't as real as he had thought. This propelled him to pursue true freedom, to become a real boy, so to speak. And much like Pinocchio, Spamton was forced to confront many challenges. He struggled to find success as a salesman, which forced him into the waiting clutches of the person on the phone, who then seemed to promise Spamton the chance to have all his wildest dreams come true, only for that same phone person to abandon him at the last minute. This is fascinatingly similar to the part of Pinocchio's story, where he too is manipulated by a devilish figure into visiting a magical land of freedom and fun, only for that figure to betray the puppet later on.
Pleasure Island. Looking for little boys. Oh god, you know, that whole section of the movie just so creepy.
And of course, after being abandoned, Spamton had to struggle to get back into the mansion. However, the big difference here between Spamton and Pinocchio is that Pinocchio's trials ultimately benefited the young doll, who became a stronger and better person with each obstacle he overcame. By contrast, Spamton did not benefit from the struggles he faced. Quite the opposite. The challenges Spamton faced, rather than make him stronger, only served to make him more damaged. Each obstacle just made him lose more and more of himself. First, he lost his friends, then he lost his wealth and fame, then he lost his mind, and finally...
Which is kind of ironic, given that he lost his friends because of the wealth and fame, and then he lost the wealth and fame. So, yeah, that sucked.
Finally, he lost his agency altogether, reduced to a literal puppet on strings. Pinocchio is about a puppet gaining life, humanity, and freedom by becoming a real person, while Spamton's story is about a real person losing everything until he is reduced to a broken husk dangling from strings.
Geez, when you say it like that, the story of Spamton is really depressing.
It's a rather clever bit of writing, I must say, and I especially appreciate how the theme of freedom is utilized to compare and contrast Spamton with another major character in Deltarune. I am, of course, referring to Jevil.
Yeah,
Jevil,
there we go.
like Spamton, was a powerful secret boss, so comparisons between the two are inevitable. But what's interesting is how Toby Fox intentionally draws attention to their differences in this story.
Clown around town.
People mention how some unspecified big shot hated clowns, and Spamton himself repeatedly rants about the clown around town. This comparison between Jevil and Spamton leads us to one of the most interesting narrative dichotomies within Deltarune, as both of these characters exist to tackle the idea of freedom.
Oh god, and the whole thing about the freedom motif in the music comes about, was a whole meme after chapters 3 and 4 came out. And again, this is the problem with watching a video this old and outdated, where it's not going to bring up any of the stuff going on with Tenna as well. That hurts.
Jevil repeatedly mentions how he's the only free one, and he promises to show the heroes what it means to be free in their battle.
Which, so far, apart from seemingly Gerson, the only secret boss we fought against that was actually free was, Gerson. And you look, and the only secret boss we've actually fought against was Gerson. That was actually free, because he didn't use the crystal, he didn't go mad. Jevil is insane because he thinks he's free when he's literally in jail. Spamton wanted to be free. There's the whole thing you could argue about, Ram supposed to be the secret boss, and with the Roaring Knight and stuff like that. Then you have Gerson, the only one of them that's actually free.
In his backstory, Jevil, much like Spamton, had an encounter with a mysterious entity who seemingly drove Jevil mad. This encounter convinced Jevil that life was just a meaningless game, and that the only real meaning to it was to have fun. The narrative Toby Fox seems to be weaving here is that Jevil, when confronted with the reality that his choices don't matter and that he doesn't really have any freedom, took this news rather well, and used this revelation to justify him doing whatever he wanted. After all, if he has no real agency, then he can do whatever he wants without consequences. The buck does not stop with him, so why worry? Jevil felt liberated by this revelation. I believe that's why he says he's the only free one. I don't think he believes he's actually free, but rather, by coming to terms with his lack of real freedom, he is freed from the bondage of morality, society, and everything else. He is free to do whatever he wants, with one of his voice lines literally him saying, "I can do anything." By realizing he has no...
Which, I relatively recently learned was actually based off of a sticker.
no true freedom, he is able to achieve a sort of internal freedom, which he cherishes. This is the complete opposite of Spamton. Spamton, upon realizing he had no freedom, proceeded to devote every waking second of his life to finding freedom. To him, having no freedom was a nightmare. Without freedom, he couldn't do or be anything.
Yeah, without freedom, he had no freedom. Gee, imagine that.
Everything becomes meaningless if freedom was a lie. So to him, chasing freedom was a necessity. This contrast between these characters' worldviews is reflected in their behavior. While both of them are somewhat insane, Jevil is quite happy, while Spamton is intensely unhappy. Jevil has come to terms with his bondage, while Spamton rages against the one pulling his strings. Jevil finds liberty in his lack of meaning, while Spamton finds nothing but despair. This meme literally summarizes their difference in worldview perfectly. This dichotomy very effectively showcases the two extremes one can go to when confronted with the idea of your choices not mattering, which is what I think Toby Fox was going for. On one end, you have Spamton, who fights tooth and nail for freedom his entire life. While on the other end, you have Jevil, who not only accepts the hand he has been dealt, but also outright revels in it. I think this is why Spamton hates him. Jevil revels in what Spamton considers outright slavery, which infuriates him. Notably, neither of these characters seem to be considered in the right by Toby Fox, as they are both antagonists that are shunned by the majority of characters. But establishing the incorrect responses to this theme is necessary if Toby Fox wants to provide a correct interpretation later on. It's impossible.
Which makes me wonder what that interpretation may be. Like, I could imagine, you know, this being like, I don't know, like one of those square charts or triangular charts. Like, would it be like, I would obviously imagine that Gerson would be on the other side. I'm just trying to think of like how he would, I'm just trying to think right now how he relates to the others.
Possible to know what Toby Fox has in store for the future secret bosses. But if he continues the trend of having each secret boss confront this theme of freedom, then I'm going to guess that these future bosses will fall somewhere between the philosophical extremes established by Spamton and Jevil. I think Toby Fox gave us these two characters as our first secret bosses because he wanted to establish the two extreme ends of this spectrum before using future bosses to flesh out the more moderate philosophical stances between them. This is just a small prediction on my part, I could be wrong, but it makes a lot of sense from a narrative perspective if Toby Fox intends to further delve into this particular theme. There's one last element of this freedom theme that I think warrants attention, because it seems to demonstrate a particular stance Toby Fox himself has on this topic. You see, Spamton isn't the only instance in which Toby Fox has written a narrative based around the pursuit of freedom. In fact, Toby made an entire game with this as its focus. I'm of course referring to Undertale. In this game, everyone in the kingdom is seeking freedom, with nearly every monster desperately praying for some way to escape their underground prison. Even the story of Frisk is, ultimately, about them seeking freedom from the underground. However, quite notably, the story of Undertale went very differently from the story of Spamton.
Yeah, you actually got freedom.
The general consensus is that freedom is inevitable. They even have a prophecy confirming that one day an angel will set them free. Of course, some interpret this freedom to be the freedom of death, but still, the overall narrative still supports this notion that freedom will come. The monsters even fully gain their freedom in one of the endings, supporting the notion that freedom is not only possible, but achievable. And if you focus your attention purely on Frisk, they always achieve freedom by the end of the game. No matter which route you are on, they will always escape the underground. This is quite different from Spamton, who never achieves freedom no matter which route you take. In every timeline, Spamton fails. This, of course, raises the question, why? From a narrative thematic standpoint, why does Spamton fail? If I was Toby Fox and I wanted to tell a story and prove a point about the nature of freedom and what it takes to earn freedom, then why would I have the Undertale characters succeed while Spamton always fails?
Okay, now I'm wondering, because that's honestly a very good question. So, like, you can't say, I mean, given that Frisk worked to get out, you can't say that the want to get freedom and, working for it could be the problem. Could it be obsessing over? But then all the monsters in the underground kind of did, and arguably Frisk did too, given that, depending on how you look at time, they were only in the underground for, like, what, a couple of days at most? So then what would the difference be then? And that is it for now, unfortunately. This is, of course, a part of a much larger reaction, so link to the next part should be appearing, somewhere over my face, as well as in the corner of the video. I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you in the next part. See ya!